Alright, so in this particular lesson we're going to cover essentially what we covered last week in class. So we're going to be taking this very basic model and we're going to be setting up proper hierarchy over here just like we did in our mechanical models for the mechanical style of animation. And then we're going to assign a set of bones and then set up paint weights for those bones so that they control our hand model, even though I don't have a thumb yet. Thumb works pretty much the same way as the other fingers. So we'll set up the hierarchy of the models themselves, or the objects themselves, into one giant group, then assign joints, set the joints up into a hierarchy of their own, bind the skin, this would be the skin, and bind the bones and the skin together, and then we're going to set up some controllers so that we can curl our fingers without going into each individual joint and curling those on our own. Alright, so let's get started. I already have my hand, and I'm using that term very loosely, set up. Over here you can see that I've already gone ahead and named all of my objects from the wrist to the palm. Each of the spheres represents the joint, and then each of these represents a length of the finger or finger bone. So essentially I'm setting up a type of a skeleton. So how do we set this up? Well, we have to set up a hierarchy first. So we're going to be parenting each of these objects to the next successor in line. Alright, so how do we do that? We're going to be using the P button. So we select the first object in line, then we're going to shift select the second object in line, and we're going to hit P. Notice that placed my index bone inside of an index joint, or parented it to my index joint. You can see that over here in the outliner, as well as when I click on the joint. Now we can see that both objects turn green, opposed to before when this was green, one was green and one was white, which meant they were not parented to each other. Alright, so we're going to continue this all the way down into the hand and into the wrist. We're going to make the wrist the master of all of, or the parent of all of the hands and fingers and finger joints. So we click the index joint, we shift click the next bone in line, we hit P, and then we reselect this joint, which then steps it up to the next level. We're going to continue this, P, select, shift, P, select, shift select, P, click. All I'm doing is reselecting, shift selecting the next in line, parenting it to it, and then reselecting to show that it's back in line. Now that I have this all set up, I don't need to reparent my hand to the wrist at any point. Now I can just walk down the rest of these three fingers and parent them to the palm, and we'll drop them down right here. So I'm going to start with the middle one, come to my joint, P, joint to the bone, P, bone to the joint, P, joint to the next bone, P, and so forth. So this finger is entirely grouped together or parented together, and then I do one last time. Notice now it's grabbing this finger as well, but it'll drop it below here. So when I hit P, this is now parented. And we can see when we come up here to the palm that now I have the palm and the index. So index and then middle. And we're going to continue down just like that. Nice and quick. So now 3 fingers. And we have all 4 fingers. So now if we look, we can see that the wrist is parented to the palm. I'm sorry, the palm is parented to the wrist, and all 4 fingers are parented to the palm, and inside of each finger is a hierarchy of the individual joints and bones that are connected to one another. Alright, so this is essentially just step 1. Now that we have this done, we need to come over to the top left. Currently we're in the rigging, modeling. We need to go to rigging, and then up here you can see that we have our skeleton. Down we have create joints. Now, before I start creating joints, typically, right now I'm in top mode, I'm going to come into my wireframe mode so I can see what's going on, and I can come up here and turn off my ability to select objects. Now, depending on how much you have revealed up top, it may look something like this. You can expand these out simply by clicking to give yourself all of your top bar options. Alright, so I'm going to click on the one that looks like a diamond, and then now I can't select any of my objects. This will keep me from accidentally grabbing any objects while I'm trying to place all of my bones. So I'm going to come into my skeleton and go to create joints. I'm going to grab that guy, and I'm going to start down here on the wrist. Insert this and move him into place. I'm just going to name these as I go. From here, I'm going to hit Command D and drag this one out. This is going to be my palm. Command D again. Drag this one out to my finger, my index finger. I'm going to assume this is the index and this is the pinky. And I'm going to name this index. And then make some copies off of this guy. Command D to duplicate, drag him out, and once more, drag him out. Now, when you're making joints, in order to make bones, I actually have to add an additional bone to the tip of this finger so that I can make a bone. A bone is the combination or a joint parented to another joint. Alright, so now that I have these joints made, I can go ahead and make duplicates of them, drive them up like so, duplicate again, put those here, and once more put those there. Now, if I were smart, I probably would have gone ahead and set up all of my joint rotations and limitations first before I did that. So now I'm thinking about it, let's actually set that up first because we're going to have to do it anyway. So I have these. If I come in and look at my limitations in my base finger, right? Let's start out here at the very end. If I come to my attribute editor, Down here towards the bottom, we can see that we have what's called joint and degrees of freedom. The degrees of freedom refer to how these joints are going to bend towards one another. It's going to be easier to see once we actually do some parenting. So let's parent these together. I'm going to click on this guy, shift click this, and hit P and walk myself down the line exactly the same as I did earlier. And into the wrist. Alright. Now you can see that we have the same kind of hierarchy, but just with a single finger. Alright. So if I come out, currently I can rotate these bones completely freely in all degrees. Because this is a finger, that's not something I want to happen. Alright. So I need to come out, select this guy, and then figure out what degrees of rotation I actually want. So because it's a finger, these end bones, or these end joints, are only going to move in one axis. Currently, based on the world, they're only going to move in the z-axis. So it pulls up and it pulls down, just like so. Alright? So we want to turn off our y and x. Notice here, it grays out our rotation, which means that these two channels are now blocked in that area of rotation. Alright? So we're going to do that down here as well. Lock the x and the y. Now when we get to this, the base of the finger, your base of the finger not only moves in the z, but it can move left or right or back and forth in your y rotation. The only thing it doesn't do is twist, which would be your x rotation. So we want to turn off our x, and then we want to come down and limit the distance that y can move. Alright? So we're going to come down here to limit information. Down here in y, we want to limit the rotation of the y rotation about 10 degrees in each direction. So they can only move here and here. We don't want a finger that can move all the way out like this, right? And we don't want it to come this far because it's going to be interfering with these fingers. So we want a finger that can only come over a small way in each direction of y. So if I put this back, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to change this to negative 10 degrees. I'll hit enter. And then I'm going to come over here and say 10 degrees positive. What that's going to do is limit the distance that I can move this finger. Now perhaps negative 10 is too far. That's going to be up to you. If it is too far for your liking, you can come back to here and say, maybe I only want negative 5 degrees. So I'm just going to change that, and I hit enter again. Now, it pulls in 5 degrees. Oops. That's incorrect. I had those backwards. This is why it's good to check your rotations as you're making them. So it was the positive 5. There we go. And notice it shows you what your current angle is. So you shouldn't have a real big surprise. But it's definitely good to check your rotations as you're going for your limits. And you can set your angle back to 0 in here. Alright. So now that those are set, let's go ahead and grab all of these joints, and let's see if we can make a copy of them while they're still parented. Beautiful. And notice, because we set these up here first, it's maintaining all of our limit information throughout. The only thing we have to do is make sure that we come in here and then rename each of these. Accordingly. I'm renaming these tip instead of giving them a number. That way, as I'm going through, it's just a visual reference for me when I start skinning these, that those don't actually get skinned to anything. Right? I'll make another duplication, pull into there. Looks pretty good. And one more, pull this to here. Notice too, since I paired the index to the palm and to the wrist, it automatically dropped it into my hierarchy in the proper fashion. So that saved me a good bit of work as well. All right. So now all I have to do is make sure I go back and name all of these. I'm trying to keep the names relatively close to what I named them up inside of my objects, just so it's easy to keep track of what I'm going to end up parenting to each one. Now, some people watching this might think, well, why am I not copying and pasting the name? It automatically updates the number at the end. Well, that would be true, except for the fact that these are already parented to one another. Once they're parented to one another, I can name this little, and that little, and this little, and that little, all the way down the line, and it's not going to give me a separate number because it's already at a different place in its hierarchy. So you can have multiple things in multiple levels of hierarchy named exactly the same. So that's one little quirk that you have to remember when you're naming your objects. Alright, so now we have a bone system and we have our objects. Currently, these two are not connected to one another. So if I move my finger bones, nothing happens except for the bone. Alright, so what we need to do is bind the skin to the skeleton. Currently this is the skin. I need to come back up here and turn that off. Remember, we turned off our ability to select our objects, so we had to come back and turn that button back on. So we have to bind the skeleton to the skin. So I'm going to select my skeleton, then hold shift, and then select my skin. Then I'm going to come up here to skin, bind skin. Now it's important to note before you do this that whatever your object is, you want it to be done, complete. Because if you bind the skin to your skeleton and then go back and decide, oh, I don't like how my model looks, I need to make an adjustment, well, it's going to remove the bind from your object at that point. So just make sure you're completely done, happy with your skinned or your object before you go ahead and bind the skin to it. So we're going to bind skin. Now when we come out here, we can see that our object is purple. It wasn't purple before, it was white. This is showing me that it's bound to another object, right? Now the movements of this object group are being controlled by another set of objects, in this case the skeleton. Also, if I select on the set of objects, I can see that it has changed the color of my bones from green to this gradient of colors from an orange, yellow, green, slightly greener to a blue. This is showing a level of influence throughout the joints starting at the wrist. Right. So what do we have so far? So far we have our index joint that we can now rotate. Problem is, you can probably see we're getting all kinds of really funky interactions between these fingers. My index finger, for one, is bending my palm around, and my index finger and middle finger are interacting with each other, which shouldn't happen. That's due to the automatic skin weights. Essentially, it's taking the distance between my joints here and saying, well, this object is pretty close to it, this object is also pretty close to it, so let's go ahead and let this influence this finger here. So there's a lot of influence going between these that shouldn't be existing. So that's our next step, to make sure that the influence is what we want it to be. So, that being said, we're going to come up here into Skin, Paint Skin Weights. I'm just going to come over here and grab my options for the Paint Skin Weights. And that's going to pull up my tool settings. And you can see already, now some of you guys may have your object selected, and you can see that brings up an entire list, or you can come in here and have the joints themselves selected. What we want is to have the object selected at this time. So we can see that we have all of these different joints available. All right. And you can see as I'm stepping down through my joints, it's highlighting different areas of my model. So we're going to want to go ahead and use this tool to change the influences of everything that we have here. All right. But we're going to use this tool in conjunction with our hierarchy out here. So I'm going to expand each of these all the way out. Don't need that. This way I have all four of my fingers, my palm and my wrist, easily selectable on the left, and all of my joints easily selectable on the right. Now, what we're going to be doing is painting the skin weights inside of geometry. Skin weight, interactive. These things we're going to keep the same. We're going to be using the flood tool. The flood tool at this point is set up to flood pure white. Pure white means 100% influence, especially if I have opacity set to 1 and value set to 1, then it's 100% influence. All right, notice my min-max value is also 0 to 1, which means zero influence, or full influence. All right. So what we need to do is slowly step down through the hierarchy from the top all the way to the bottom, giving proper levels of hierarchy to the joints that will control that particular area. All right. So we know that the wrist is the top of the hierarchy. It controls everything in line. So the first thing we need to do is flood the wrist object and the wrist weight joint with white. If I come out here, we can see levels of influence currently from the wrist based on the white, which is actually gray, which means that there's other things influencing this hand. So with this selected, I'm going to hit flood, and now it's going to flood all the way down. Now, you might ask, why isn't it flooding my fingers? That has to do with the level of influence, or the layers of influence. So right now, 1, 2, 3, 4 objects down, it's not getting to the 5th object, right? Or to the 4th joint, which is fine. As we march our way through, you're going to see this slowly take its way down. All right, so we have white flooded in, so we have 100% influence, and from here we're going to follow this down the line. So I'm going to click my palm object in my hierarchy. Notice it deselects here, and then I'm going to come over to my palm joint. Notice it's moved this down just a touch, but my palm is black because all of the influence from my palm joint was just flooded back to my wrist. So we're going to go ahead and flood white so that the palm matches the palm. Flood. Now I'm moving further in. Now I'm going to come down to my index joint 1. I want my index joint 1 to match my index. Notice again it's black. We're going to flood with white, which is flooding outwards. Now, this next one, my index joint here, which is going to be right here, I need to come over and make sure that I look and make sure that I'm selecting the right areas, right? So I have index joint 1, which is this sphere. Then I have the index bone, which is right here. I want this joint to sit right on index joint 2. Notice. Then flood, and I'll continue this down the line one more time. So it'll come index joint here, and then index 2, which is right here as well, and flood. Now, we're not going to flood or deal with index tip right here. We're stopping right with the joint itself. The tip isn't going to have any influence, and we're not going to use index 3, just the bone itself, right, in this particular style. So we're going to do that same process down the line on these other 3 fingers. I'm going to come back to my middle joint. And I'm going to grab my middle and flood. Then my middle joint, middle 1, flood, middle joint 3, middle 2, flood. Come here to my ring. For some reason, it broke these up into 2 areas. I'm not really sure why it did that. Okay, so I'm going to grab that, come to the ring joint, and flood. There we go. Now I'll put it back into my hierarchy properly. I think it just hadn't updated itself for whatever reason. Flood, ring 1, ring joint, flood, ring 2, ring joint, flood, I'm going to come over here to my little, there we go, and little joint, flood, little joint 2, little 1, flood, little joint 3, and my little 2, which is right here, flood. So now I have this set up to where if I go into my queue, so I'm using Q to exit out of my paint tool, get rid of that. I can select on my bones, let's grab this index, and hit my rotate. And now as I rotate my finger up, notice nothing else bends or warps except for the areas that we want.